You know that feeling when you and your best friend, or your roommates, just magically seem to sync up? Welcome to our explainer on lunar and sisterhood menstrual synchronization. It's absolutely one of those cultural touchstones that has sparked, well, countless late night conversations. Maybe you've heard that human bodies naturally align with the phases of the moon, moving to a rhythm far bigger than ourselves. It's a beautifully poetic idea, right? And it's been around for centuries. So today, we're going to dive right into the math, the myth, and the modern noise behind all of this to uncover what is really happening inside our bodies and our environments.
For decades, it's been this widely accepted, almost kind of hidden truth that friend groups synchronize their periods, or that ovulation is intimately tied to the new or full moon. But to truly wrap our heads around this phenomenon, we have to pull back the curtain and completely separate the biological reality from the deeply felt psychological experience. We have to ask ourselves, does the universe literally have a remote control for human hormones?
So historically, this primal folklore was divided into two distinct paths. First, you had what's called the white moon cycle. That basically meant a person would ovulate right on a full moon and bleed on a new moon. Then you had the total reverse, the red moon cycle, where ovulation aligned with the new moon and bleeding with the full moon. Now, early historical studies actually seemed to support this connection, which made the folklore feel incredibly validated. But actually, scratch that. There was a massive catch to that early research. Those studies usually only looked at very small, highly selective sample sizes, specifically groups of women whose cycle lengths already happened to naturally match the moon's 29.5-day schedule. When you only look at the data that fits your hypothesis, you're always going to find a pattern. But what happens when we zoom out to the entire human population?
Over 7.5 million. Let that number sink in for a second. That is the exact number of menstrual cycles analyzed by the period tracking app Clue. This was definitely not some tiny study of a dozen people with perfectly timed rhythms. We're talking about a massive, modern demographic analysis aimed at finding the undeniable truth about lunar and sisterhood syncing. Because when you start looking at millions of data points instead of just a handful, the picture completely, and I mean completely, changes.
When you analyze that much data, the results are just crystal clear. There is absolutely no statistical correlation between the lunar cycle and human menstruation or ovulation. Across the general population, ovulation is fairly divided and completely randomly distributed. It effectively and finally debunks the concept of a cosmic remote control dictating our biology from space. And on top of that, the science shows that human pheromones do not reliably trigger mass cycle synchronization among roommates either. That whole idea, which was originally called the McClintock effect, came from a 1970s study suggesting sweat pheromones caused syncing. But it has since been widely debunked due to some pretty significant statistical flaws in that original research. There simply is no biological mass pheromone syncing going on behind the scenes.
So, if the moon isn't pulling the strings, and pheromones aren't sending invisible signals, what exactly is happening? Well, it literally comes down to the math of coincidence. Think about it. A stated lunar cycle averages roughly 29.5 days, but a typical human menstrual cycle ranges anywhere from 24 to 38 days, with the global average hovering right around 28 or 29. Because these numbers are close but not exact, they act almost like two-car turn signals blinking at slightly different speeds while you sit at a red light. Cycles just naturally intersect on a rolling basis. Statistically speaking, about half of all people will occasionally have a cycle phase land within a few days of a new or full moon purely by random chance.
Okay, but if it's all just random math, why does it feel so incredibly real when it happens to you and your friends? It really comes down to three realities. First up is the law of averages. If you have four close friends with varying cycle lengths, they will mathematically overlap or drift into sync periodically before drifting apart again. Next is confirmation bias. We fiercely remember the months we synced up with our bestie, right? We feel totally connected, but we completely forget the months our cycles were 2 weeks apart. Finally, shared environment. Roommates often share stress levels, sleep schedules, and eating habits. Those shared environmental factors can actually temporarily nudge cycle lengths closer together.
Now, just because a biological trigger is technically a myth doesn't mean your experience is fake. There's actually a concept for this called phenomenology. It's basically the idea that your subjective experience is a valid, structured, and measurable reality of its own. When you and your inner circle find yourselves completely in sync, that feeling of bonding, community, and shared rhythm is a genuine happening. Even if it's just math and calendar variations pulling the strings behind the scenes, the profound human connection you feel is totally valid. To put it into perspective, think of it like the color spectrum. The colors we see are subjective experiences, but they are anchored to an objective, measurable physical reality, which is electromagnetic wavelengths. The physical medium there is universal.
But when it comes to lunar menstruation in our modern world, the physics of the moon's gravity and light simply do not couple with the human endocrine system to create a universal biological rhythm. It just lacks that physical celestial tether. So instead of a cosmic signal, this incredibly powerful shared connection is driven by three very tangible metrics. First, shared environmental variables. Literally living in the same house, eating similar foods, or matching each other's stress levels. Second, temporal mathematical statistics, which is just the absolute certainty that varying periodic cycles will eventually overlap. And third, the physics of human attention. Our brains are basically giant pattern recognition engines. Once we notice a parallel with a friend, our perception completely locks onto it and amplifies its significance.
But wait, because there's a really fascinating catch to all of this modern data. What if the environment we live in today is actually hiding a historical, biological truth? Think about it. What if the data we just looked at is totally skewed by the way we live right now? If our scientific instruments are calibrated inside a completely artificial environment, we might actually be measuring a modern distortion rather than the true evolutionary baseline of the human body.
This is where it gets wild. Chronobiologists, the scientists who study our biological rhythms, reveal that historical records from eras before widespread urban electrification actually do show clearer statistical peaks where human cycles synchronized with lunar and gravitational rhythms. But today, we have something called artificial light at night, or ALAN. Streetlights, glowing LEDs, the constant glare of our smartphones, it all acts as a massively powerful masking agent. This constant artificial illumination actually disrupts our pineal gland's melatonin signaling. It's essentially scrambling the internal timekeeping of the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, which is the chemical messaging system between your brain and your body.
Honestly, relying on millions of data points from people living in brightly lit cities is a bit like trying to study the night sky from the absolute middle of Times Square and then confidently concluding that stars just don't exist. If light pollution has flattened the data, then the millions of cycles analyzed by modern tracking apps are simply describing a population heavily insulated from the natural dark. Just because you can't see the stars in Times Square doesn't mean they aren't there, right? It just means the modern noise has completely drowned out the ancient signal.
So while the math conclusively shows that today's sisterhood sync is largely a mathematical coincidence of overlapping calendars and shared stress, it really does make you wonder, have we simply drowned out our original celestial tethers with our glowing screens? What ancient rhythms might we actually rediscover if we ever truly went back into the dark? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring those fascinating everyday mysteries.